This is GBN Originals. I'm Emma Trimble. And this week, we have seen so many stories. In fact, even in the last month, stories about Christianity, whether it is the king talking about Ramadan, but not mentioning anything about Lent, whether it's the Church of England tweeting on Shrove Tuesday about net zero rather than mentioning Shrove Tuesday at all, or whether it's the biggest story of this week, which has been the school in Hampshire, which had decided to get rid of its Easter services entirely out of respect for diversity. So Christianity is very much in the news. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Father Jamie Franklin, who is the priest of Holy Trinity Church in Winchester. And he's also the author of a brilliant new book, which has been published by Hodder and Stoughton, entitled The Great Return: Why Only the Restoration of Christianity Can Save Western Civilization. So thank you so much for joining me, Jamie. So what would you say to those who, if this is a good place to start, what would you say to those who have been saying, well, you know, we're not a Christian country anymore. Church attendance is in decline, belief is in decline. And so we can't really complain about all of these things that I've just mentioned because we're not really a Christian country. What would you say to that?
Well, thanks, Emma. I appreciate that. And thank you for having me on. I think what I'd say to that is, and this is essentially the argument of my book, is that I really think that we're sort of living on the fumes of Christianity, as it were, in this civilization, in this generation. I think that there are many Christian concepts and ideas that we still want to hold on to, but we're having a difficult time with it. So chief among those, I'd look at something like, you know, the idea that we're all sort of equally valuable or something like that, which is fundamentally a Christian concept. But in various different ways, we can see the erosion of that idea happening in our society. I would point to, for example, the conversation around so-called assisted dying as evidence of that. I think it's actually constitutive of or indicative of an erosion of that idea that we're all equally valuable. It implies that people at the end of life, for example, are expendable or economically expendable and therefore should be gotten rid of. So that's where I would start with this. I would say that, you know, people want the fruit of Christianity, broadly speaking, but you can't have the fruit without the root. And the root is actually belief in Christianity and the whole metaphysics and practice that goes along with it. So I think that's the issue. I'm not really telling anyone what to do in the book. I'm just sort of saying that this is the reality. You can't have a Christian civilization without Christianity. So we need to decide what we want. Do we want to be a Christian civilization, in which case we need, broadly speaking, belief in Christianity and support for it? Or do we want to be a post-Christian civilization and embrace whatever the implications of that might be?
Do you think that the decline of Christianity actually is the root cause of many of the crises that we're seeing in Britain, but also in European Western societies more generally?
Well, yes, I do. This is the thing: is that many people would sort of debate what constitutes a crisis. I would suggest that this issue that I've just raised with you, in terms of the dignity of each human being and the sacredness of the holiness of their lives and the need to care for people who are vulnerable, to care for people who are marginalized. I would suggest this is a crisis, and that it has been a crisis actually for decades. To me, the so-called assisted dying legislation that's being put forward is the other shoe to drop after the admittedly 50-year interval since the Abortion Act. But I see these as basically indicative of the same movement or the trend in society. So I would say that. And I also think that, broadly speaking, the sort of the breakdown of social cohesion that we see in our, we're just talking about Britain. I think that it's hard to see how that can't be attributable to the decline of Christianity, because Christianity was the religion which held our society together. It's not to say everyone was a Christian, 100 years ago or something like that, but there was a sort of Christian ethos that was shared, and there were values and ideas that went along with that, and there was a sort of cohesiveness to the society, which is clearly broken down. Part of it is because of the dogma and the practice of multiculturalism and the sort of unfettered immigration that we're seeing, and we have been for some time now, at least for sort of 25 years or so, slightly longer, maybe we'd associate it with the Blair government. But yeah, I see that as a problem. I think the whole concept of multiculturalism is incoherent, because you need some kind of religion. I mean, it has to be a religion. I was going to say a religion or a philosophy or some kind of ethic to bind a society together. And the idea of multiculturalism kind of implies that you can sort of forgo that necessity. And really, what we're seeing is a breakdown of social cohesion as a result, and a sort of vying for dominance amongst various different ideological points of view. And in my book, and again, I'm not telling them what to do, and I'm not even making any kind of judgment on this, but it just seems inevitable to me that Islam will become much more of an influential factor in our society, just in terms of the numbers of people coming into the country who are Muslims, our low birth rate, and the strength of Islam as an ideology. So yeah.
Why does that matter? Because obviously, I mean, you obviously, as I do, believe that Christianity is true. So that would be one key reason to thinking that should be the foundation of all things. But besides that, in your book, you go into the kind of philosophical foundations of, where things have gone wrong in Western societies and Western civilization at large, but particularly in Britain. What is the contrast between, these three options? We have Islam on the one hand, which is sort of partly born out of multiculturalism because it carves out a space for that in the public sphere. Then you have sort of in the middle kind of secularism that we've seen growing and growing, maybe perhaps we could say since the 60s. And then on the other hand, you have the Christian theological and philosophical assumptions. And this kind of goes into the very, very foundations of a worldview. What are the implications of those ideas for the way that we construct society and the sorts of problems that we end up having as a result or not?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a big question. I argue in my book that, as I said earlier, that we inherit various ideas from Christianity, and particularly focus on ideas around, what human beings are, how human beings should treat one another, and so on and so forth. And this is really rooted in a sort of Christian metaphysics of human beings made in the image of God, there being one God, so there being one ethical standard, and also the specifically Christian revelation of God in Christ, and the way that, we're coming up to Easter season, we particularly think about this at this time, the way that God loved us in Christ. He dignified the individual with his love and service of the individual. He hung around with working class, anachronistic term, but fishermen and ordinary people, and served them and so on. So there's a great sort of profundity in all of this, which is like a kind of a leaven which leavens societies over centuries and millennia. And so we could talk for a long time about the sort of historical implications of this, but a big part of the burden of my book is trying to correct the historical record, around things like slavery, for example. I mean, the only sort of civilization that had any kind of taboo on slavery was the Christian civilization. The first explicit denunciation of slavery was in the 4th century by Gregory of Nyssa. So you get these kind of notions of human beings made in the image of God, slavery. There's a bit of a question over that, and it becomes over time in a Christian civilization unacceptable. You also get the elevation of the status of women and children in Christianity. Again, we've absorbed all of these ideas, so we're not even aware that they exist. But like the notion, for example, that children are sort of human is actually a Christian idea. It was not the case in the classical world, in the Greco-Roman world. People considered that children were sort of subhuman because they didn't share in, or partly human because they didn't share fully in the logos, the rational principle, and so on. So all of this stuff, we don't even know that it's Christian, but it absolutely is. And I think in terms of the secular side of things, I think what we're seeing is, as I said, like an erosion of that idea, both in terms of the protection of every individual. So, at the beginning of life, I would say, with I think, the abortion thing, but the abortion thing becoming more extreme, and the increasing kind of liberalization of abortion laws, to the extent where we're seeing something which is actually in some ways analogous to the Greco-Roman practice of exposure of infants now, when we talk about partial birth abortion and things of this sort. At the end of life, we've got, people who are elderly, people who are terminally ill, being considered expendable. And, we've seen in places like Belgium and Holland and Canada how this has expanded to encompass other people who are poor, people who are depressed, even people who have hearing problems and all kinds of crazy stuff. So I think we're going to see that kind of thing. And I think what we're seeing is an antagonism between men and women now, which is, I would say, is a kind of a post-Christian thing in that sense. I think I think the transgenderism thing is in some ways a sort of a manifestation of a kind of what I think of as a post-Christian patriarchy, which is a sort of an attempt on the part of certain types of men who seem to be extremely sort of perverse, but nevertheless, they want to sort of colonize and dominate women's spaces. As I say, for most people, it comes across as absolutely weird and perverse, but it's something that seems to be obviously happening. I can't really understand why you'd get these men participating in women's sports, for example, otherwise. But I think that's a sort of indicative of post-Christian patriarchy. And what I mean there is, like, in Christianity, you clearly have, even in the New Testament, the seeds of the notion that men and women are made in the image of God, and they should both be treated with respect, in the marriage relationship, for example. The Apostle Paul talks about that in the book of Ephesians and elsewhere. And as the influence of Christianity fades, so will the influence of these ideas. So you will get this antagonism back between men and women. And I argue, I mean, this is a sort of broad thing to say, but if it's just a case of a sort of post-Christian secularism taking over, I think what will happen is just that the strong will begin to subjugate the weak again, and the principles of pity and compassion for the weak and so on, they'll just fade away over time. And so I think we will end up with a situation where we have a properly post-Christian patriarchy, not the kind of, fantastical patriarchy that certain liberals think exists at the moment, but a proper patriarchy where women are genuinely subjected. So anyway, that's a bit about secularism. In terms of Islam, I think what we'll get there is we'll just get Islam. We'll get the thing I always talk about here, which I think illustrates it, so well, is Michelle Houellebecq's novel Submission, where it's an imaginary scenario, a fictional scenario that Houellebecq imagines in the not too distant future, a political party coming to prominence, an Islamic political party coming to prominence in France and winning the general election. And what happens shortly after is, the women are in the hijab. Women are not allowed to study. I think in that book it's in sort of higher and further education, what we would call higher and further education. The educational establishments are taken over by the state, by the Islamic State, not Islamic State, but the state which is Islamic, and various other things that brought in. Alcohol is made illegal, and all sorts of things. But I think that's just what would happen. So the implications in terms of transition from a Christian society over to a post-Christian society to an Islamic society, in that sense, I think are very clear.
Before we move on in a minute to talking about the sorry state of the Church of England, I just want to come back to some of the examples that we've seen in recent weeks, or even this week, more in the news about this new sentencing guidelines. Some people saying this, two-tier justice. This is an example of the erosion of equality before the law. The same with this new guidance that's just been put out by the National Police Chiefs Council, which is effectively talking about creating equal outcomes in terms of racial disparities. So focusing on outcomes rather than, again, on equality of the process of equality before the law. Is that something that in your mind, just as an example of a policy that those things that we take for granted as a society, that actually in many ways until the very recent present have made us a Christian society in our foundational assumptions, that actually that's a sign of, we're coming to the end of living off the family silver. And what we will end up with is losing the justification, the sort of instinctive justification for basic things like equality before the law, because it's being replaced by, say, philosophical worldviews that are grounded in things like critical theory.
Yeah, well, they're grounded. Those philosophical worldviews are grounded in antagonism between groups, and I think that is a fundamentally post-Christian notion. It is reflective of a post-Christian metaphysics, where it's a kind of flux, a sort of chaos of a war of all against all. So yeah, in that sense, I do think that. I think that there is. I mean, obviously, there's some sort of there's debate as to the sort of origins of ideas like the rule of law and habeas corpus and whatever it might be, but these things do arise quite clearly in a Christian civilization in the later medieval period. There's influence from the Greeks and the Romans in our legal system and in our politics in terms of democracy. But fundamentally, I think you have to consider that these things are Christian, and they're so congruent with Christian notions of this word equality. I think it's been sort of hijacked and misused. And so I'm reticent to sort of use it. But you know what I mean when I talk about sort of the equality of human beings, the equal value of human beings, and the sense also, and this is a metaphysical idea, but the sense that there is something which is higher than opinion, there's something which is higher than power, and that thing is actually the truth. And in the Christian metaphysical tradition, the truth is one of the transcendentals which is associated with the being of God. So God is goodness, beauty, and truth. God is above power, is above opinion, is above culture, and so on and so forth. And so the rule of law metaphysically is congruent with that idea, because it's an appeal to something higher. And it's really interesting, coming up to the Easter period, if you look at the confrontation between Jesus Christ and Pontius Pilate in the Gospel of John, one of the most famous lines in the Gospel there is when Christ says he's come to bear witness to the truth, and Pontius Pilate says, "What is truth?" And that notion that like truth is kind of an incidental thing is a sort of pagan idea. It's not a Christian idea. Christian idea is that actually the truth is binding. The truth is objective, and that everybody is subject to it. Everyone's subject to justice in that sense. So yeah, so I think when we see the situation where people are not being subjected to the same standards of justice, I think we are looking at something that's fundamentally sort of post-Christian in that sense, a post-Christian metaphysics, post-Christian idea of justice that's at play for sure.
Yeah, I think people have become desensitized because it is the culture, it is just, or has been for a very long time, just assumed. People have become desensitized to just quite how revolutionary and historically different the ideas of Christianity are when compared to other worldviews. So let's just talk about the Church of England for a little bit. The Church of England seems to have taken on extraneous ideas from outside of, Christian theology, had taken on certain, whether it's secular assumptions or in some cases maybe even from philosophies like critical theory.
Yeah.
Where has the Church of England gone wrong? What exactly is going on at the moment in the Church of England? And are they letting down the country and basically betraying their duty to the nation?
Well, so it's a big question. So I think one of the things I'd like to say is that the Church of England is, when we talk about the Church of England in this context, we're probably talking about the sort of the bishops basically, and the stuff that you see in the media. In many, many parishes around the country, there's great stuff happening, great churches all around the country. I hope mine is one of them here in Winchester. And they're not out sort of virtue signaling and making woke videos about climate change. They're actually trying to do what they're supposed to do as parish churches. I think that the Church of England in its kind of institutional form has been largely captured by the forces of secularism. I think that's probably the easiest way to say it. I think there are various things that go along with it. A dialing down of the supernatural components of Christianity. You don't really hear bishops talking about that very much. A dialing down of the distinctiveness of Christianity as well, and also what I would characterize as a kind of perennialist view of Christianity, which is actually the kind of thing that I think you hear when you hear King Charles, talking. I think that he articulates this sort of perennialist view, whereby Christianity is a sort of it's one religion amongst others, and it therefore has a kind of utility in the amelioration of social problems. So the purpose of religious faiths is to kind of work together to create a better society. I think that the Church of England has bought into that idea too much, and I think that's basically what's going on. And I do think that there is trying to choose my words carefully here. There's a very unfortunate virtue signaling element to it, which I have to say I think is from a spiritual perspective, I think it's a really bad thing to engage in. I think there's too much concern for what the world out there trying to sort of make ourselves acceptable to the world out there by conforming to the standards of the world. To me, that's like completely opposite of what the church should be doing. The church should be proclaiming the gospel, teaching the Christian scriptures, and teaching what's distinctively Christian about our faith to the congregation, proclaiming it to the world, and then inviting the world into the church. So that's what we should be doing, and we shouldn't be doing the other way around in that sense. Nobody cares anyway. Nobody's interested in these videos about climate change. The one that you mentioned on Shrove Tuesday, if you actually look at the likes to negative comments ratio, I mean, it's absolutely appalling. I can't remember what it was, but it was something like 8,000 or 9,000. I worked it out. 8,000 or 9,000 people had to watch that video before one person clicked the like button. So nobody likes this anyway. It's completely ineffective. And the church needs to turn things around. We need to start proclaiming the authentic gospel. My book is an attempt to try and articulate a sort of intellectual case for Christianity and why it's so important. And we need to rediscover our confidence. We need to rediscover our intellectual confidence. We need to rediscover our spiritual confidence, our psychological confidence, and we need to get out there and engage robustly with the world. We've bought into the rubbish. I'd use a stronger word if I could, but I'm a vicar. We bought into the rubbish, Emma, and the church is hemorrhaging critically as a result of it.
So, Jamie, what do you think the future of the Church of England as the established church is? Because many people would say, you mentioned the perennialist worldview, they say, okay, well, Christianity is waning, but why not Islam, for example? What is the future of the established church? Should we have an established church? Because it seems that there are many within the Church of England's leadership that actually sort of want to disestablish themselves.
Yeah, well, I think, establishment is a privilege which is given to the church, and it's given to the church so that, as I've been saying, so that the church can be a Christian witness to the nation. So the idea is that we're given a privileged place in order to fulfill that function. Now, if we're not fulfilling that function, it does raise the question of what the point of an established church actually is. And I do understand that. But it's rather ironic for the bishops who are not fulfilling that function to kind of be implying it themselves. So you would rather hope that the bishops and other representatives of the Church of England would be arguing for establishment and making the case for why establishment is important. We're living in a post-Christian nation. These secular values are coming in, and it's eroding the moral fibre of our society. People are hopeless. People don't have any direction in life. They don't know God. The Church of England needs to be established so that it can have this platform to be a witness to the truth of the Christian faith. That's what the point of establishment is. That's what they should, in my opinion, be arguing for. So that's that. What will actually happen? I'm not entirely sure. I think probably what's what's likely is that the bishops in the church in the House of Lords, will be reduced in some sense, maybe even got rid of almost entirely. I'm not worried about this. One of my great spiritual heroes is a man called Bishop of Lincoln, Bishop Edward King, and I remember reading one of his letters, and he said, the church managed without establishment for the first 300 years of its existence, and it can very well do without it if it is disestablished again. So God will still have a church. There'll still be the Holy Catholic Church around the world, and all the many hundreds of millions of Christians around the world. If the Church of England is disestablished and eventually dies, I hope that doesn't happen, and I hope that we recover our confidence and regain a more prominent place in public life as a result.
There are some who are talking at the moment about a sort of resurgence, anecdotally, a resurgence of Christianity, particularly among the young, particularly to more traditional forms of Christianity, whether it's Anglo-Catholicism or the evangelical side of the Anglican Church, which the leadership considers to be very unpopular. Is this something that you're seeing? Is there something to this?
I think one of the things we can see is a reaction, I would say, in a sort of intellectual sphere. There's sort of various sort of intellectual celebrities who have converted to Christianity or are kind of Christian adjacent. You might think of people like Niall Ferguson and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Christian adjacent people like Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, people like that. So I think that is new. I don't really remember that 10, 15 years ago, that sort of high profile sort of Christian conversion thing going on at that level. And for the reasons broadly congruent with what we've been talking about. So I do see that's happening. What I don't think there's a sort of mass rebirth of Christianity, as somebody like a Christian commentator Justin Brierley would say. To me, things still seem very, very secular. When I walk outside my front door and I talk to people on my street, I've knocked on all the doors of my street, and I think there are maybe like 3 or 4 houses where there are Christians who live in them. Most people are just still like thoroughly secularized. So I think in that sense, I'm not seeing like evidence of a wide rebirth, but there is something going on. The other thing you asked about is traditional forms of Christianity. Is there an appeal here? Is this actually working in some sense? The main evidence I'd point to for that is the traditional Latin Mass in the Roman Church, which is extraordinarily well attended by young people. You have families with kids running all over the place, for Latin masses, which is kind of extraordinary, but it is happening. It's real. It's happening in this country, up and down the country. I'm an Anglo-Catholic priest. I've been I'm at this a short time, but I do think we do see an interest in traditional forms of worship. I'm very passionate about it. I believe it can really reach people in this generation. And we have since I've been around here, we have seen quite a few sort of younger people, particularly men, I would say, coming into the church and being interested in a more traditional form. I think part of that is that the traditional forms of Christianity are more challenging in some senses. They emphasize things like discipline, spiritual practices of prayer, fasting, other sort of things which are a bit more challenging. There's a sort of otherworldliness to traditional forms of Christianity like Anglo-Catholicism, which I think is interesting for people, the kind of mystery and that kind of thing. So I think there is something there. Evangelicalism is the other, it is the strong suit in terms of growth in the Church of England. And there's something about evangelicalism which does connect with lots of people in the culture. It does remain very strong.
What would you say to those who are maybe, for very good reasons, feeling very disenchanted with the Church of England, and would maybe say, well, I don't want to go to the Church of England parish because the church has gone so off the rails? What would you say to those people? Would you encourage them to go to church and get involved? Or do you think that, their reasons are legitimate enough to stay away?
Well, it's a really difficult one because it varies so much depending on where people live and what churches they're near to. So, as I said earlier, there are many, many great churches in the Church of England with faithful priests who are ministering faithfully orthodox doctrine and doing a really, really good job. And it's those people who are actually being let down by the sort of central comms of the Church of England, which give this awful impression that it's just a church which is entirely captured by wokeness. So if you can find one of those parishes, then I'd say, absolutely. I mean, as I say, I hope mine is one of those parishes where people could come and they could feel like they're going to receive something distinctively Christian and orthodox, and that they're not going to have some kind of leftist political agenda pushed on them. However, it's by far, if I can put it like this, not a guarantee that you're going to encounter one of those churches if you just rock up to your local Church of England church. I mean, really anything could happen. So my suggestion would be to check out the website and talk to people before you attend. And there are normally various warning signs, that you could pick up fairly easily. So so I do want to argue that there is still a lot of spiritual life in the Church of England, but there's also a lot of crazy stuff going on as well. And a lot of it should be avoided. And
finally, maybe in a nutshell, if that's possible, because I know it's quite a big question.
Yeah.
There'll be many people who are viewers of GB News watching this video who are perhaps atheists. Maybe they might call themselves cultural Christian, but they don't, really sincerely believe, but they maybe see a sort of value in Christianity. Maybe they feel a bit rubbed up the wrong way when they see the erasure of Christianity in the public square in the name of diversity. What would you say to those people with respect to, as the title of your book says, that the only way to save Western civilization is the restoration of Christianity? What would you say to those who would say, well, actually, it's possible to do it atheistically, it's possible to do it in a secular way?
Well, I don't think it is, and the argument I give is that your metaphysic, by which I mean your basic view of reality, eventually it's going to manifest itself in culture and law, and in various other, in academia and in various other environments as well, and you can't just hold on to ideas that you might like unless they're grounded in some kind of reality. So, and that's what I'm saying about, the notion of the equality of human beings. I was listening to David Starkey talking about this the other day, talking about how he believes passionately that people are not equal. Well, he believes passionately that people are not equal because he's an atheist. And that's a consistent position. And that's a position that will work itself out over time. So it's a tricky one because, you've got people who want to be supportive of Christianity, maybe, and Christian ideas, but they don't believe themselves. So that's a bit of a conundrum. And I do talk about that in the book. But I would say, the root and the fruit, they have to match each other, and they will match each other eventually.
And so people now know that if they live in the vicinity of Winchester, there is a good church they can go to. They can go to Holy Trinity Church in Winchester. And the title of the book is The Great Return, Why Only the Restoration of Christianity Can Save Western Civilization. I truly, truly cannot possibly recommend it enough. Buy it online, buy it from any bookshop that's worth its salt. So thank you so much, Father Jamie Franklin, for talking to us today. And as you see, I really, really do endorse the book thoroughly. So please do get yourself a copy and do like and subscribe to this video so that you can keep up to date with everything that GB News Originals puts out. I'll see you next time.